This eMultiple Sclerosis Review program is presented by DKB Med Radio.
It's important to explain the limitations of available clinical trial data and how we are making decisions based on best available evidence combined with clinical expertise. We need to help to ensure that patients understand that while there are limited racial and ethnic data in clinical trials, we are using a very comprehensive clinical monitoring program to help ensure that their safety is being evaluated and adjusting treatment as needed.
Barriers to minority participation in MS clinical trials. Welcome to eMultiple Sclerosis Review. Racial and ethnic minority individuals with MS. Why has their participation been so low in so many MS clinical trials? Is it a continuation of their historical mistrust of the medical community? Is it the lack of diversity in the trials that guide clinicians when they make their treatment recommendations? Is it the barriers to minority participation that continue to be under-recognized by the clinical trial designers? And how can clinicians overcome these impediments to provide the safest and most effective care for all individuals with MS? To discuss these and related issues, we're joined today by Dr. Mima Akinsanya, an assistant professor in the Department of Neurology at the Georgetown University Medical Center and director of the Multiple Sclerosis Clinic at Georgetown Neurology at Clinton in Washington, D.C. For our guest disclosures and additional CME information, please go to our website, emsreview.org, and select the Volume 6, Issue 12 link. I'm Bob Busker, executive producer of DKB Med's e-literature review video programs. Dr. Akinsanya, thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Our overall learning objective for today's program is to explain the limitations of clinical trials that lack inclusive representation of people from racial and ethnic minority groups. So the focus of this first part of our conversation is explaining how underrepresentation in MS clinical trials limits the applicability of treatment efficacy and safety data to diverse populations. So that said, if you would please, Dr. Akinsanya, start us out in the clinic with a patient scenario.
Absolutely. So a 39-year-old Black woman with newly diagnosed relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, or RRMS, presents for a follow-up after initiating ublituximab, a highly effective disease-modifying therapy, or DMT. Her MRI shows no new lesions or disease activity, which is an encouraging sign of treatment response. However, the patient reports ongoing fatigue and mild cognitive difficulties, which impact her daily functioning and quality of life. During the visit, the patient shares that she recently read about the lack of diversity in clinical trials for MS therapies. She expresses concerns about whether the medication is truly effective for someone of her background. Additionally, she worries about potential side effects that might not have been adequately studied in Black patients.
This underrepresentation in MS clinical trials of people from racial and ethnic minority groups, Doctor, have you found that many patients in your practice are concerned about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon that patients question if a certain DMT is effective and safe in people of their race and ethnicity background. Patients may not be well versed in MS clinical trials specifically, but they often know that overall, race and ethnicity minorities are very underrepresented in clinical research. So as a result, I've heard patients express that they feel uncertain about starting a therapy without clear evidence that's tailored to their race and ethnicity demographic. So the patients may question whether the chosen DMT will put them at higher risk for side effects due to things like differences in genetics.
These are definitely legitimate concerns. How would you advise that clinicians address them during the patient's visit?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really important to first acknowledge the limitations of the existing data and validate the patient's concerns about the underrepresentation. They're not wrong that we really don't have enough data on race and ethnicity minorities when it comes to MS clinical trials. So overall, a priority is to build a strong therapeutic alliance through active listening and open dialogue. This makes sure that the patient feels comfortable and confident in the clinic visit and with the provider. And then also providing clear information about the known benefits and the risk of therapy based on the available evidence, emphasizing the importance of reducing relapses and preventing disability, because this is what we do have strong data for in general in MS. So specifically when it comes to race and ethnicity groups, what we can share is any real world data or subgroup analyses that covered minority groups, just still acknowledging that although this gives insight, studies with large numbers of patients are still needed to provide confident answers. And then in this particular patient, if they were concerned about the lack of data with ublituximab, I would share what we do know thus far about the CHIMES trial.
The CHIMES trial, that was a study on ocrelizumab. But as you reported, this patient has been responding well on ublituximab. Is there a disconnect here? What am I missing?
Yeah, so ublituximab and ocrelizumab actually have the same mechanism of action, so the findings are likely very applicable.
Good point, doctor. Okay. So if you would please then, give us a capsule summary of CHIMES.
So CHIMES is the first prospective trial to address racial and ethnic disparities in MS. And they particularly focused on Black and Hispanic or Latino patients with relapsing remitting MS. So the trial included 182 participants, 113 self identified as Black, and then 69 self identified as Hispanic or Latinx across sites in the mainland US, Puerto Rico, and even Kenya. And they really focused on different strategies to help improve accessibility to these race and ethnic groups.
Those strategies to improve accessibility. What can you tell us about those?
Yes, so Chimes was really intentional about addressing several disparities seen in MS DMT clinical trials. They developed the trial in collaboration with patients, advocacy groups, as well as investigators and the pharmaceutical industry to really promote inclusive participation. And this is something that's really commendable because most MS DMT clinical trials have not been as intentional about including patients and advocacy groups. An advisory panel, again, with all of these groups, was able to review the written patient materials just to help ensure that they were culturally sensitive to the groups, the race and ethnicity groups that were included in the trial. And in terms of specific strategies for accessibility, they also included transportation assistance, um, childcare reimbursement, multilingual materials, as well as culturally sensitive patient resources. So, again, a very thoughtful and intentional trial, specifically catering to the needs of these race and ethnicity groups.
And the key findings from these CHIMES trials, doctor?
Yeah, so key findings included that participants had greater disease burden. So, for example, they had larger T2 lesion volumes on MRI compared to the previously looked at ocrelizumab trials that were predominantly white cohorts. And another key finding is that at 48 weeks, 46% of Black patients or participants and 58% of Hispanic participants received NEDA, which stands for no evidence of disease activity, which is great news.
So the CHIMES trial results, they make a good case for efficacy. But the patient specifically mentioned she's concerned about the safety of her DMT. How should clinicians address safety concerns when treating patients from groups underrepresented in clinical trials? What would you advise?
So again, it's really important to acknowledge the limitation and validate the patients that these concerns are very understandable, and it's important that we as clinicians are able to discuss them with them. I would try and reassure this particular patient that she would be closely monitored for side effects with regular follow-ups, routine, which include routine lab testing and MRI scans. Any potential safety concerns that she may have would be fully investigated and reported to the pharmaceutical agency, as part of understanding how the medication was affecting her particularly. And some different strategies to help mitigate safety concerns include adjusting the treatment, potentially switching to another disease modifying therapy, or even adding supportive strategies or medications to help address her concerns. Overall, it's very vital that patients feel that their concerns are acknowledged and taken seriously.
Well, given these concerns, what steps should clinicians take to ensure that treatment decisions are made with a patient's full understanding, especially when there's been such limited diversity in clinical trials for MS therapies?
Yeah, so just reinforcing or reemphasizing such an important point that open, honest communication is really key. It's important to explain the limitations of available clinical trial data and how we are making decisions based on best available evidence combined with clinical expertise. We need to help to ensure that patients understand that while there are limited racial and ethnic data in clinical trials, we are using a very comprehensive clinical monitoring program to help ensure that their safety is, being evaluated and adjusting treatment as needed. This is also an important opportunity to provide additional resources, such as patient education materials that really highlight the importance of diversity in MS clinical trials and encourage the patient to consider participating in MS clinical trials to help increase diversity.
And registries fit into this scenario how?
Yes, registries are an amazing way for patients to, help us understand how MS shows up in different populations. And there are two registries that focus specifically on patients from underrepresented race and ethnicity backgrounds. One is the National African Americans with MS Registry, or NAAMSR, and the other is the Alliance for Research in Hispanic MS, or ARHMS. And those are two registries that patients can go and Google online and, self-register to, again, help us understand how does MS show up in different populations.
Thank you, Doctor, for this very enlightening conversation. Our key learning focus for this part of our discussion is to explain how underrepresentation of MS clinical trials limits the applicability of treatment efficacy and safety data to diverse populations. What are the most important concepts from our conversation you'd want our learners to take back to their practices?
Absolutely. So, first, it's essential for clinicians to validate patient concerns about the applicability of clinical trial data, particularly in regard to underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. This really does help build trust and a strong therapeutic alliance. Second, engage patients in shared decision making by discussing the potential benefits and risks of available treatments, while also educating them on the limitations of current clinical trial data due to the lack of diversity. Third, the use of discussion is an important opportunity to educate patients about the diverse representation in clinical trials and how their participation can help ensure future treatments are more applicable to a wider range of populations. And then lastly, it's important to ensure that your clinical approach considers a patient's background, culture, and experiences, making them feel valued and understood in the decision making process.
Nice summation, Doctor. Thank you. And we'll return with Dr. Mima Akinsanya from the Georgetown University School of Medicine in just a moment. Providing the best care for your patients takes more than identifying the most relevant information. It takes expert opinion and analysis of the data, combined with expert advice about how to most effectively put that information into practice. It takes the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine e-literature reviews. Top experts in their specialties, selecting the most important peer-reviewed literature, analyzing the information, and explaining what it can mean to clinical practice. E-literature reviews, independent medical education, CME, certified by Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and presented without charge by DKB Med. Welcome back to today's eMultiple Sclerosis Review program, focused on explaining the limitations of clinical trials that lack inclusive representation of people from racial and ethnic minority groups. Our guest is Dr. Mima Akinsanya from the Department of Neurology at the Georgetown University School of Medicine in Washington, D.C. And we've been discussing how underrepresentation in MS clinical trials limits the applicability of treatment efficacy and safety data to diverse populations. Let's turn now to our second key learning focus, which is to describe the barriers to minority participation in MS clinical trials, which extend beyond general distrust of the medical system. So, if you would please, Dr. Akinsanya, take us back to the clinic with another patient scenario.
Yes. So a 44-year-old self-identified Afro-Latina woman with multiple sclerosis presents for her routine follow-up visit. She has been radiologically stable on her current DMT, however, has ongoing clinical progression. During the visit, you mentioned a clinical trial for a new MS therapy that she is eligible for. She expresses some hesitation about participating, citing concerns about time commitment, transportation challenges, and needing time off work. She also mentioned feeling uneasy about research, stating that she doesn't want to feel like a test dummy.
What advice, Dr. Akinsanya, do you have for a clinician hearing these types of concerns? What are some of the most important things the clinician needs to consider and to communicate?
Yeah, so it's important to be patient with these conversations. You may not be able to have them in one visit, but you may need to set up multiple visits in order to fully address the patient's concern. It's also important to show empathy and reinforce that, again, the patient's concerns are important to you to address. Recognizing the historical factors that contribute to mistrust is also very important. So these include systemic inequities, such as the Tuskegee experiment, medical experimentation that occurred during slavery against people's will, the racial segregation that happened in hospitals well into the 1950s and 60s, as well as, the ongoing issue with Black maternal mortality. It's also important to reassure the patient that now clinical trials are conducted under very rigorous safety protocols and are carefully monitored to protect all participants, regardless of race or ethnicity background. These conversations require shared decision making and encouraging the patient to ask as many questions as they have and express any concern so that they can really be confident in their decision to participate. Providing clear, culturally sensitive materials to help the patient make an informed decision is really important as well. So, for example, you could provide material in the patient's primary language if it's not English. You can also use infographics with culturally represented images. So, this could be infographics with people from diverse skin tones, different clothing that represents different cultural backgrounds, or even different community settings.
Thank you, Doctor. We've been talking about the advice you can give to the clinicians who directly interact with their patients. Let's broaden our focus now to include the teams who design the trials and develop the parameters. What specific barriers do these trial creators need to address to help maximize minority participation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are multiple barriers, as you mentioned, that can really preclude patients from being able to participate in trials. One of them is just their awareness. So it's important that if you are part of a clinical trial team, to really be specific and intentional about targeting patients from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups in order to, just make them aware that there are clinical trials that they may, decide to participate in. Another one is access to the trial sites. Are you making sure as the clinical trial team that you are having trial sites that are actually in these patients' communities versus requiring them to go a long distance that may not be feasible for them? Another thing that people who are part of the clinical trial team have to consider is, the comorbidities that exclude patients from participating in the trial. Do these comorbidities, need to be part of the exclusion criteria, or is it possible to be more flexible in the exclusion criteria to help to make sure that patients from minority groups are able to participate, if they do have these comorbidities? It's also very important to think about partnership with community organizations. This can really help to increase awareness and participation of patients from these groups. So again, making sure that people from community organizations are even part of the trial team, maybe as an advisory board, can be very, very beneficial to increasing the patient participation. Other things that people who are part of the clinical trial team can consider is the cost associated with participation. So, is it possible to provide some type of stipend for transportation or missed work, or just some other type of resource to help mitigate those barriers? Because these can often be deterrents for patient participation. And something I do want to mention is that a 2021 survey of over 2,000 people with MS asked patients from various race and ethnicity groups about their attitudes towards research participation. And the responses overwhelmingly revealed that although there were some concerns about mistrust, the majority of patients actually have very positive attitudes towards research involvement. So, another thing that is very important for clinical trial teams to be aware of is that patients from minority racial and ethnicity groups often do want to participate in clinical trials. So, it's really about being thoughtful and intentional about how to mitigate any barriers that would preclude them from participation.
Being thoughtful and intentional about how to mitigate barriers that might preclude minority individuals from participation. Nicely phrased, Doctor. And this seems to be a great place to wrap up our discussion. Our key learning focus for this part of our conversation is to describe the barriers to minority participation in MS clinical trials, which extend beyond distrust. So, what are the most important points both treating clinicians and clinical trial developers need to be aware of?
Absolutely. So, first of all, it's important to understand that barriers to participation extend beyond mistrust and include systemic, individual, and interpersonal challenges, such as financial burdens, logistical concerns, and the patient provider relationship. Secondly, building trust with patients is paramount and requires proactive efforts tailored to underrepresented communities, including partnerships with local organizations and culturally sensitive engagement strategies. Number three, when participating in clinical trial development, offer solutions to address logistical and financial barriers, such as transportation assistance, flexible scheduling, childcare support, and clear communication in the patient's preferred language. And the last point is to encourage diversity by incorporating more inclusive eligibility criteria, recruiting diverse investigators, and creating trial protocols that reflect the needs and realities of underrepresented minority populations.
From the Department of Neurology at the Georgetown University School of Medicine in Washington, D.C., Dr. Mima Akinsanya, thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us in today's eMultiple Sclerosis Review program.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. This is such an important topic that I'm very passionate about, and I'm excited for all of the clinicians to really learn and understand how, as a community, we can further diversity in MS clinical trials. Thank you again for having me.
For eMultiple Sclerosis Review, I'm Bob Busker.